those grain particles. So, once we have the recipe together, we're going to put it in that very large mill. All the mill's going to do is grind everything up, make sure it's the same size and density. It's basically an industrial grinder, if you will. And it's going to eventually shoot all of the ingredients from the very bottom of that room. And if you guys can follow a linear pattern, if you see where that PVC pipe starts, you guys are going to follow that right over here to this grain silo. So is everybody still with me? We got the recipe together, we grinded everything up, and we got from point A to point B, behind us again. Any questions so far? I know it's pretty complex stuff. I'm gonna take a sip of beer. I hope I don't lose you guys. You guys have been good, wonderful people. Surprising that it actually does work. No, not really. Don't try it. You have to know what you're doing, but they know how to do it. I've never tried to do it personally. I thought about it before when I was. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Yeah, first time to get fired. So, we have all the ingredients in that grain silo. We're going to have to start making sugar water now. So if you might not be able to see, but if you see a very large funnel device by those glass windows, where that guy's standing by texting that shouldn't be away from the door, doesn't notice. Probably going to trip right here, hopefully not going to trip. Okay, I guess he still doesn't notice we're talking about him. Where he is right now, that very large funnel device, that's called our mixer. That mixer, as its title suggests, once again, I use that phrase a lot, is going to mix everything together. We're going to start dropping these flavoring ingredients inside the mixer. We're going to start pumping that water in the mixer as well. There's a very small turbine at the very bottom of this mixer that's going to mix all these ingredients together. And again, all we're doing right now is converting all the starches over to sugars, as well as getting all the color and flavor out of these grains. We've yet to add any bitterness, aroma. We've yet to add, alcohol has not been created yet. All we're doing right now is worts, W-O-R-T, or sugar water, or glorified sugar water. And we're going to use that mixer to mix everything. So where is the residual liquid that's been mixed going to go? It's going to go in that copper tank that's a little bit closer to us than the wooden tanks. Does everybody see that tank? That tank is called our mash tun. And within that tank is a very large arm. It's going to basically mix everything together, make sure it's evenly distributed. The very bottom of that tank is going to be a very large filter with small holes. The only reason I say it like that is because if I say a very small filter, it's not like it goes in like a small drain like this. It's a very big filter with small holes. Probably didn't need to explain that. So this filter is going to filter out all the grain and flavoring ingredients that we can't use anymore. All the grain that we don't want, it's spent. We took out all of the starches, converted them to sugars. We also ruined the ingredients in the sense that we took all the flavor and color out of them. So we cannot use it for any more beer, all of that grain. So what are we going to do with that grain? We are actually going to scoop it out. We're going to put it in a grain trailer by that first loading bay door that's closest to us. In the summer, you might smell it. It doesn't smell the greatest. It's just a grain trailer sitting. A farmer comes about 2 to 3 times a week. I'm sorry, 2 to 3 times a month, and will pick up that trailer for feed for his cattle. So again, we can't use it. The farmer is going to use it. A lot of other breweries will make fish food, dog treats, bread. I believe 5 Seasons, the brew pub down the road, all of their bread is actually made from their own spent grain they make for their beer. So really, really cool. So again, we get rid of our grain, we're left with this residual sugar water, nothing floating around your beer now. Don't need it anymore. So now we have this 170-degree sugar water, wort. We're now going to pump it from that copper tank into the tank closer to us. If you start to see a pattern, the tanks go in order. Pretty easy for us to talk about. So we're going to be looking at that very large metallic tank with the orange ladder leading up to it. Does everybody, can anybody read on the side what that tank's called? I mentioned it earlier. Kettle? No. Kettle, yeah, kettle. You guys got it, you guys are smart. It's kettle. This is where we're going to add the hops. This is also where we're going to heat it up to about 220 degrees. The reason we're going to heat it up to 220 degrees is so we can keep it perpetually boiling. Why are we going to boil the water? As you mentioned earlier, I believe, to kill off any bacteria that's made it this far in the process. This is also the temperature which we're going to add our hops to the, I can't say beer yet because it's not beer, to the liquid, if you will. We're not going to get into the hopping method because it's very complex, but if you want to come find me after, more than welcome to talk to you about it. We're just going to talk about the 3 main things the hops are going to add to the beer. The hops are going to add, you guys want to guess first? You guys are pretty, hoppiness, but what does that mean? Well, bitterness. There we go. So bitterness. Okay, there you go. Bitterness, or IBUs, those international bitter units. So the nice grapefruit taste you get with the Hop Atlanta. We got 2 more things. One's kind of obvious, and one you're probably not going to get. Aroma? There you go, you got it. Aroma, the nose of the beer. You're going to smell your beer, that's what the hops are going to prevalently add. And the last thing, anybody want to take a guess? Somebody's going to tell you. Not carbonation. Not yet. That's what the yeast is going to add, actually. It's going to add natural preservatives to the beer. So again, what we're talking about when we're adding hops, we're just talking about bitterness or IBUs, like you guys said. We're talking about aroma, like that gentleman said. And then we're talking about natural preservatives. So does everybody know what IPA stands for, hopefully? Another question no one's ever missed. India Pale Ale, awesome. Does anybody know why?
Because they used to put the chemical in the beer.
Not you.
They came from like traveling on the boat.
She is right. Every story basically revolves around the same fact of preservatives. Mine's probably on the lower level of being credible, so don't use my version of the story. Probably not the best thing to say before you tell someone a story. Basically, British sailors going from India around Africa back to Britain would have to basically drink beer the whole time because it wouldn't spoil. The beer was spoiling too quickly. They figured out the more hops they would add to the beer, the longer it would last. They also figured out that there was a prevalence of hop crops in India. So these British sailors would jam these beers full of hops before they went on the voyage, and the beer would not spoil. They also figured out that it would raise the alcohol content as well as the bitterness. And they were already drinking pretty bitter English pale ales, if you will. So that's a little bit of history, but again, those natural preservatives were initially the reason they used them. Now, obviously, flavor, the nice bitterness, the aroma. It seems like every brewery is in a race to try to kick you in the face with as many hops and how bitter they can get their beer. We are not like that. We're not we're not in that hop race of trying to make the bitterest beer ever. So our hop blend is going to be more of a mild a mild IPA, kind of a summer IPA, if you will. It scores pretty low on the International Bitter Units. I believe it's a 64, whereas some of these other beers get up to 120. So there's a lot of bitterness to be had. So all we've talked about thus far, to recap, is the water back there. We talked about the recipe, getting that together, making sure everything's consistent for quality control. And then we talked about the grain silo. We talked about mixing the ingredients together. We eventually got this water or liquid into this kettle, this large metallic tank. We added the hops. The hops added what? Aroma, bitterness, and then preservatives. Awesome. And now that's where we are. We have 220-degree hop-infused sugar water, basically, to put it ridiculously simple. What are we going to do now? Well, I'm going to drink some more beer. So if you guys want to join me, I think everyone's probably almost done. I'm sorry. You're more than welcome to grab another one and come back. I'm not going to stop, though. So now we're going to have to cool everything back down. Does anybody want to guess what temperature we're going to end up cooling this liquid back down to from 220 degrees? 65. She got it. Oh, it's that guy's birthday. 21. Big day for him. Yeah, it's on his birthday. He's just been acting like a jackass the whole tour. So, 220-degree liquid. We're going to have to cool it down to 65 degrees, like she said. Why are we cooling it down to 65 degrees? Because this is the temperature at which ales are going to go into our fermentation tanks. Again, we only make ales here. The opposing style of beer, lagers, is going to be operating at about a temperature of 30 to 40 degrees. So we do not make any lagers here. We have in the past, but again, the difference between lagers and ales is ales are going to operate at 60, 70 degrees, and it's only going to take about 3 to 4 weeks to get your final product, your final beer. Whereas lagers, like I mentioned, which we do not make here, are going to operate at a temperature of 30, 40 degrees, so marginally cooler, and it's going to take about 3 to 4 months for a lager to be done. So a much different product. Same thing, it's still beer, different methods, and again, we do not make any ales, I'm confusing you guys now. We do not make any lagers here. In my opinion, ales, you can get away with more vibrant flavors, a lot more styles, but then again, I work for a brewery that only makes ales, so that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So how are we going to cool everything down? If you guys look at what's coming off of that kettle, that pipe that leads into that very large rectangular box, you can kind of see it. That one right there. Thank you, sir. Being a little model for me. It says P1 on it as well. That's called our temperature regulator, our heat exchanger. It's basically equivalent of a radiator. It's going to run a coolant one way. It's going to run this hot liquid, this 220-degree liquid the other way. And it's going to cool everything down from 220 degrees to 60, 70 degrees at a rate of 25 gallons per minute. So a very impressive machine. very quick. It doesn't sound very awesome, but when you think about it, how much liquid is being cooled down from 220 degrees to 60 degrees is ridiculous. So once we get down to this nice temperature that ales are going to be operated at in the fermentation tanks back here, we're going to pump all of that liquid through pipes, and we're going to end up in one of these large vats behind me. When we're talking about the tanks, we're not talking about the flat bottom tanks that are closest to us. So these two tanks that are parallel's the wrong word, adjacent maybe. You guys gonna help me out? You guys have been drinking beer all day, I guess, so. Perpendicular, is that it?
Adjacent works.
Adjacent works, okay. These two tanks that are adjacent to me, I hope that works, are flats, not the tanks, not our fermentation tanks, not what we're using right now. We're talking about every tank behind that with the conical bottom or the triangular bottom. These tanks are fermentation tanks, they're 100-barrel tanks, so very large tanks. Before we put beer into it, it seems obvious, but we're going to obviously have to figure out that it has to be empty. We don't want to pump liquid on top of liquid and overflow a tank. We also don't want to mix any beer. So once we basically empty it, when I mean empty, I'm talking about kegging our beer, bottling our beer. So once all the liquid's out of one of these tanks, we're going to have to clean it and sanitize it and change the filter out. Once the tank's ready to go, we're going to start filling all the liquid we've been talking about into one of these large tanks. At this point in the process, we're going to add the yeast. Does anybody want to guess what happens when yeast eats sugar?
Makes alcohol.
Creates alcohol, and then one other forgotten about ingredient. Someone said something. Carbon dioxide, or CO2. So again, we're going to add the yeast. The yeast is going to add, or not add, it's going to create two byproducts when it eats sugar. All the sugar we've been accumulating thus far. It's going to create alcohol, and it's going to create CO2. We do not need the CO2. We don't naturally carbonate our beer. So if you look back here and see one of those red buckets on the alleyway, those are basically buckets that are full of water with hoses coming into them, and that's going to be basically the CO2 coming out of the tanks. It's going to be bubbling. So if you go back there, typically if the bucket's bubbling, that's CO2 gas coming out of the tanks directly. And we just have it in there. Hold on. Okay, genuine question. We just have those in there so we can see it bubbling, we can actually know the gas is coming out rather than having a hose just on the floor. Obviously you can't see visible gas. Let me get this hopefully genuine question. Why don't we like the natural CO2? Why don't we have to add it? It's not that we don't like it, it's obviously a lot easier to regulate at the end on a massive scale if you can do it in one of these large tanks, these bright tanks. So we're letting out all the CO2 also. We are just focusing on trying to accumulate that alcohol and get that final product of the beer. We don't really want to mess with the CO2 at that stage, and we don't have to. So for home brewing, it's a lot easier to use natural carbonation because you don't have to mess with anything. However, on a massive scale, when you're talking about 11,000 barrels of output, a lot easier to regulate at the very end rather than screw it up while you're trying to focus on something else. So, thank you. Thank you, Clay. Everyone, his name is Clay. Harass him all night, please. He hasn't done it. To be safe, he hasn't done anything. Well, let's go on. Okay, so we have uncarbonated beer now. So after about 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to take it out. We're going to take some of it out. We're going to send it off to a third-party lab to make sure it's consistent on a chemical level. So there is a job for chemists at almost every brewery that's established, surprisingly. We're also going to have to taste it. We're pretty good at that here, to make sure it tastes the same. We're never going to release a beer of the same name that tastes differently. I've only seen that happen once here in my 4 years, and that's never happened again. And that's not a bad beer, just a beer that didn't taste the same as the same beer they were trying to go for.
What did you do with that beer?
A lot of employees got a lot of free beer for many months.
Get hired?
Yeah, I know, right? So, we have uncarbonated beer right now, and we've figured out that it's consistent with the quality control we're looking for. Now we have to recarbonate it. So if we put it in these large flat bottom tanks to my left and right, these tanks are called bright tanks, B-R-I-T-E, in case you need to spell it sometime. Unless you guys, you don't need to know how to spell it. These tanks are basically the equivalent of a CO2 farm. And there's abundance of CO2 in both of these tanks. We're going to put all the liquid inside of these tanks, all of this beer that we can start referring to as beer. Again, this beer is uncarbonated. They're going to sit in these tanks for about 10 to 11 days at a temperature of 30, 40 degrees. And I'm not a chemist myself. I don't think I look like one. But what's going to happen right now is the CO2 molecules are going to be forced to bond back with this liquid or recarbonate the beer. It's a process known as forced carbonation. Again, all that's happening is we're putting back the carbonation that we let out of those tanks initially. So now we have, after 10 to 11 days, we have an awesome beer with carbonation in it.